So, Debra, if you are ready, can we start now?
Yes, we definitely can start now.
Okay. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. On behalf of the Department of English, University of Gurbango, let me welcome you to another session in the remote lecture series that we are calling Parley 2021. Today, we are very, very happy to have in our midst one of my very old and very dear friends, Professor Debra and Castillo. She is the Emerson Hinchliff Chair of Hispanic Studies and a Professor of Comparative Literature in Cornell University, USA. And today she is going to talk about something which is not only very close to my heart, but also very relevant to the students of humanities and the researchers as well. In fact, she is going to talk about fieldwork in humanities research, its role and significance, obviously. And we are all waiting to hear from her. And before I hand over the session to her, I must convey to her a message from one of the very senior poets of South Asia, Yasmin Gunaratne, who through me is actually conveying her message to Debra. She is congratulating Debra for giving a lecture on such a relevant topic, and she says that humanities today requires all the support that it can get, and especially in the pandemic situation. So with this message from Professor Yasmin Gunaratne, I now request Professor Debra and Castillo to address us. It's over to you, Debra.
Thank you so much, Amit, and thank you everyone for joining us in this session this evening. It's morning here in Ithaca, and whenever I used to co-teach a course with my friends in Cornell University in Calcutta, the students would always ask, what does it look like outside your window right now? So this is what it looks like outside my house right now. This is my house in Ithaca, New York. And there's two reasons for starting with this. One is just that people are always curious about what things look like on the other side of the world. But also, a scholarship is always, although we pretend sometimes that it's objective and that it is it's separate from our lives, it's always very embedded in our local realities, and in what is going on around us, what we perceive and what we understand about our environment. So the questions that we're asking today are questions that are related to what is fieldwork in a humanities context, and that brings along a series of other questions, such as what is humanities' role in engaged pedagogy and scholarship? And by engaged pedagogy, what I mean is a specific thing. I mean working with a community in the co-creation of knowledge. And this is something that serves students and it serves the community. Now, when we think of engaged scholarship or engaged pedagogy or fieldwork, we often think of fields like anthropology. We think of engaged scholarship in fields like agriculture or engineering. So it's a little bit challenging sometimes to think about fieldwork in the humanities. But I'm very, very committed to engaged pedagogy. I'm very committed to engaged scholarship. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, about my own involvement in this. Many of you have heard people ask, what use are the humanities anyway? And that sometimes comes out of a question of applied research, the kind of applied research we see in other fields, like some of the social and physical sciences. And so this is a question we're often called upon to answer. And one of the ways that people think about that is to ask the question in response, is use the right measure of the value of something? And so I'll leave you to think about these questions and get right into my topic. My own commitment to research in the humanities is reflected right now in 3 edited volumes. Theorizing Fieldwork, which I co-edited with my friend and colleague Shalini Puri. South of the Future, which I co-edited with my friend Anandita Banerjee. And The Scholar is Human, which I co-edited with Anna Sims-Bartel. You will probably notice that 2 of these 3 books have colleagues and friends whose background is from India, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that has to do with these ongoing collaborations that I have found so fruitful with people in your country. I also have to reference my institutional location, which is the Department of Comparative Literature at Cornell University. This is Goldwin Smith Hall, where the department is located. And the challenge that comes from thinking about fieldwork within the context of comparative literature. There are about 4,300 universities and colleges in the United States. And of those universities and colleges, there are only about 50 programs in comparative literature in the country. And the programs that are most prominent, most visible, are in the elite private institutions like the one that I teach at Cornell University, which is a private institution, and so is very typical of the kind of comparative literature programs that we think about in the United States. The problem from my perspective is that comparative literature has been a largely conservative kind of discipline, which focuses largely on European literatures, cultures, and theoretical approaches, meaning that there is a kind of circular conversation, and it's hard to think outside the box. The challenge then is for how to think about fieldwork and think about applied scholarship in an institution or a kind of institution that has privileged more abstract production of knowledge. The other context in my own institution is an initiative that started 5 years ago, and that has to do with my institutional location, which is the Office of Engagement Initiatives. 5 years ago, Cornell received a very large grant to support engaged research. And you can see on the screen what the goals of the Office of Engagement Initiatives are. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can see what they are. Basically, the previous Cornell president and the current president have made applied research engagement an institutional priority. And the way that this has been reflected in policy is that the president has asked that every student take at least one course that would involve a community engaged component, and that every department offer at least one course. Now, this has been a challenge, as you can imagine, for the club-like and inward-looking programs in some of the literature departments like mine, like comparative literature. However, as I said, this is something that I have been very committed to, and so I want to reflect on this process through 4 of the courses that I have been teaching in the last several years. These 4 courses are Hispanic theater production, which I do in collaboration with a theater group called Teatro Taller that I founded about 30 years ago. A course called Cultures and Communities that works with local NGOs in the Ithaca community. Migration in the Américas, which looks at issues related to farm worker insertion in the United States labor market, as well as the histories of their travel and to the United States and the relation to their countries of origin, and Rural Humanities, which is something that I did as part of a new grant program that was sponsored by the Mellon Foundation, which is looking at rural lives and livelihoods in upstate New York. So these are the four that I'm going to talk about briefly, and then I'll come to some kind of general conclusions. So Teatro Taller, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is a group that does theater production, and we have as our mission producing plays in Spanish and Spanglish for the local community. We do both scripted plays, and increasingly over the last few years have been involved in collective creation productions like this one, which we did in 2019. In fact, it was one of the last couple of ones that we did live before the pandemic. This play was based on a year of meetings with community members, including children and adults, to talk about their stories and their lives and what Ithaca and Tompkins County, which is our surrounding area, was like for them. And then in collaboration with the members of the community, we turned this into a play. And this play was then presented in several locations in the area, first of all in Ithaca, but also in 4 hours away in New York City. Of course, for you in India, one of our collaborations, which was very successful, was one that we did pre-pandemic, but via a lot of screen rehearsals with our friends in Jodhpur University in Calcutta. We co-created a play called Route Map, which was about the experience of borders in India and the United States. And we presented this play in Calcutta and in the United States in several locations, including at the US-Mexico border and the US-Canada border. This play has been very successful for other reasons as well, along the lines that I was suggesting by my title. That is, it involves significant amounts of field work in terms of speaking to people about experiences and then turning these experiences into a play. The play itself, the performance of it, is a public event, and for many people, performative events are the easiest ways of thinking about how you can incorporate fieldwork into something which is academic, since performance is an academic genre. However, there's also another feed out, and that is that this particular play sparked a lot of interest, and so there have been academic conference papers and publications. Debra herself, who you see here on the screen, wrote a chapter for dissertation about her experience with this play. And there's also been other people who have written about it for academic publications in other places. So this is a group that has been producing plays for 30 years. We have nearly 100 productions now. And I have a message on the screen from one of the former students who talks about the way in which this kind of work is also political, in that kind of larger understanding of political. That is, it deals with matters of interest to the polis, to the community. What the student wrote me was, "Our work is deeply political. Our message is not communicated through manifestations or protests, but rather through creating art, a process that requires a sustained commitment over a long period of time and also entails the spirit of openness and cooperation by all parties involved." And I'll just keep moving on. The second course that I want to reference is one that I call Cultures and Communities. And this was created as a course that was supported by funding from Engaged Cornell, because we do believe in providing funding for our community partners whenever we can, and was also a collaboration with a group called Cultura Ithaca that I co-founded with a member of the community, and works in collaboration with a couple of local NGOs. So over the last years, what we've done is we've created a large number of events and programs that have been generally focused on enhancing and promoting the cultures and the artistic expression of people of Latin American descent in our area. One of our always highlight features is Latino Heritage Month, which is between September 15th and October 15th, when we have events almost every day, or and also have things like an art show, movie festival, things like that. We also collaborate with No Más Lágrimas, or No More Tears, which is an organization founded by my friend Ana Ortiz, and was originally dedicated to supporting and promoting activities for youth, especially youth whose parents were incarcerated. And some of you know that the United States has the largest incarceration rate of any country in the world. So there are a lot of children who have parents in prison. However, during the pandemic, No Más Lágrimas has really shifted its focus and has been doing an enormous amount of work on food rescue and distribution to needy families, where working with local farmers and grocery stores and other people to create a food bank where people can just come and safely just take food. So there's free food, and also local stores have contributed baby care supplies, health items, cleaning supplies, and this has been the focus of their activity during the last year. So in general, this is a program which during the pandemic has shifted focus, but over the years has had collaboration both from Ithaca College and Cornell University. And together we have generally pre-pandemic organized 45 to 65 events and programs a year, some very small and some very large. One of the things that we found is that as we became better known in the community, we also found that people came to us for other needs as well, questions about employment, or questions about people who are homeless, or women who had in situations of abuse. So although this is not something that I have been trained to do or know anything much about, I'm in a better position than some of these people to be able to ask questions and find resources for them. And so we have become involved in advocacy as well. Again, these are projects which have been the results of some of these things: the survey, data gathering, the needs assessment, the discussion of the effects of the arts and educational programming. All of these things have been written up either in technical reports or academic publications in our field, in humanities, in the arts. The third course probably needs just a little bit more introduction, I think, because it has to do with the historical relationship of Central American countries and Mexico to the United States. And this is a course that I mentioned is called Migration in the Américas, accent to emphasize the Spanish pronunciation, Américas, America, and looks at the entire circuit of migratory experience from people situation in their countries of origin, why they feel they have to leave, what happens in the long trip from their country of origin to upstate New York, how they do in upstate New York and their labor insertion in New York. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a picture of part of that famous or infamous border wall between Mexico and the United States as it runs through the Sonora Desert. And on the other side of the screen, what you have is a curve that looks at the number of Hispanics in the United States. This is the most current numbers that I found, where it indicates that there's about 61 million Hispanics in the United States. That's of a total population of 320 million people in the country. So it's a significant percentage of the population. And the important thing to remember is that while we're talking about immigration, the vast majority of these 61 million people are US citizens that were born in the country and their parents were born in the country. There are, by most accounts, about 10 or 11 million undocumented immigrants, but it's the undocumented immigrants that we are specifically focusing on. Part of the context is that Spanish is the second language of the United States, and that is reflected in the fact that nearly 70% of people who study a language other than English study Spanish, and it is used nationwide. The United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. And Mexico and the United States, as you know, share this long border. And that means that there are more Spanish speakers in North America than anywhere else in the world. That's just for a context. The other context is that where I live is very rural, and there are a lot of farms. There are both fruit and vegetable farms, and there are also dairy farms. And dairy is a year-round work, so the people who work on the dairy farms are there year-round. There's about 36,000 farms just in New York State. And the work that we were doing, because it's in our local area in Ithaca, is working with the farm workers, of which there are about 55,000 in upstate New York, mostly from Mexico and Guatemala. And just to add a little note, that's not the only people of Latin American descent in the in New York that are the only people of Latin American descent that are here in New York. For example, there's somewhere around 250 to 1,000 to 1 million Mexicans in New York City, and that's the newest group of immigrants to New York. New York has a very large population of Puerto Ricans, of Dominicans, of Cubans, Ecuadorians, Colombians. In fact, the city of New York, which is known as a very, very metropolitan, very diverse city, is a majority minority city. There are more people of color in New York City than there are white people. We also work closely in this course with our partner, which is the Cornell Farm Worker Program, which is a program that's dedicated to improving the lives and working conditions of farm workers. And most of the farm workers, as I mentioned, are either from Mexico or Guatemala, and they work on these upstate farms. You see someone here in the grape harvest because we produce grapes and wine. When we work with the farm workers, most of them are undocumented, so they are in very precarious situations. They don't want to make too much noise. They don't want to be seen in public. However, we know that they have a lot of issues, they have a lot of concerns, they have a lot of needs. How do we find out what these needs are? We interview them. And so the interview process itself is a kind of fieldwork process. And from the interviews, we learn a lot. We learn about their lives, their stories, but we also learn about what they feel are the most important issues that they need to have addressed. During COVID times, we are unable to do a lot of the kinds of in-person work that we had been doing before. So we have been doing more work. The students have been doing more work in creating short videos for them. So sometimes they are based on a live performance and then filmed. Or with COVID, we've been doing more animated shorts using the program VideoScribe, and we're distributing them via WhatsApp. Because the farm workers do have access to cell phones, they are able to see the things on WhatsApp, and these kinds of videos then can give them information even though they have low literacy or no literacy. And we're doing them in English, Spanish, Mam, and Quiche, which are two indigenous languages, as well as Spanish and English. In other times, of course, we are doing other kinds of research that have resulted in things like policy briefs, academic articles. They've also turned into presentations for the legislature on issues relating to law, changes in the law, a whole series of activities. And finally, the Rural Humanities course is a Mellon-supported initiative in public and engaged humanities that wants to use a focus from the humanities that is not social science, not physical science, but the humanities, to look at the histories and cultures and challenges of rural life in upstate New York. This is a project that came out of specifically the last 4 years of trying to understand what's happening with politics in the United States, where urban areas were far more liberal and progressive in terms of political positions than the rural areas, and that the rural areas of the United States were overwhelmingly the areas where Trump found his greatest support. So without trying to condemn people, what we're trying to do is understand what's happening in our rural communities that caught us all by surprise, such that a phenomenon like Trumpism could happen. Here is Cornell University. It's on a hill, as you can see, in a very rural setting. And this, one of the things that people forget about New York State, because if they know anything about New York, they think of New York City, is that the vast majority of the state is very rural. And here is a picture of Adirondack State Park. Now, there's a reason why I put these two pictures together, and that is that both of them feature very prominently a beautiful lake. And one of the things that some collaborators and I began to think about was this question of water. In New York and in Ithaca, we are very, very fortunate, as we have a lot of water, we have good water, and we have access to water. So we began a collaborative project with people that in the Americas from two other countries besides, or three other countries besides the United States, where we're looking at the question of water through a multidisciplinary perspective that had as its result an art project that was inspired by sharing knowledges about water. We are really aware, of course, that not everyone has the good luck of having access to safe drinking water, that some of the places that we were dealing with have too much water or too little water or polluted water. And so we were thinking about this issue, but we were thinking about it through a lens of humanities and arts. Our collaborations began with a series of meetings via Skype, because this was before Zoom. And the three main professors, besides myself, there are two other professors. One who was a specialist in international law in human rights. She's a lawyer in South America. And the other, Erika Diaz-Pascasio, is an engineer who works in water management in Mexico. So you can see this is a very, very diverse group of professors, a very diverse group of students, and the community members were also quite diverse, including a filmmaker from Ecuador, artists, and an official from the Water Commission in Mexico. One of the primary things we did was create a traveling exhibition, which included live performance. It included various kinds of interactive exhibits. It also included in Mexico, for instance, a photo competition where students, young people from across the state, were invited to submit photos with a description of why this photo was important to them. And we had a professional photographer and a team of people judge them, and we gave cash prizes. One of the other things we did, and this again is taking the original work that we had done and bringing it to a different kind of collaboration, was to work with an NGO in Mexico, which focuses on leadership capacity building among women. And we were specifically working with women in a couple of small communities in a place called Berriozábal, which the word you can see here, Berriozábal, is the name of that community. So what is the situation here is that in Chiapas, in this part of the world, there is a lot of water, but it's seasonal. And so the people in these communities... I just want to wait until it was finished. So the people in these communities either have too much water or no water. And so during a large part of the year, the question of how to gain access to water, which is often through having to walk to a stream or get access to a well on someone's private property, is very challenging. Each of these small communities has a water council. The water councils are almost always men. But one of the things that this NGO noticed was that almost all the decisions that are made about water are decisions that are made by women, whether the water is used for washing, for cooking, for consumption by themselves or by their animals, or because they don't use irrigation, they don't need irrigation, but they do use it for all these other purposes. And so the question was, if women are making all the decisions, why don't women have a voice? And of course, the women are very reluctant to speak because they have a tradition of not speaking in the company of men. So our small task in working with the NGO was to encourage women to tell their stories and to hear their voices. And we started, as we often do, with collective creation process for theater through a story circle where women were in turn asked to tell their stories about water. And then we had them act out some of the stories. And this was an activity that was used in service to and support a larger project, which was the project of the NGO of developing leadership capacity among women. This particular project, which was interrupted by the pandemic, but however, the pilot version that we were able to do is the subject of a master's thesis by a graduate student who's working with me, and we have published an article. Several of us collaborated on that. So I'm coming towards the end of this, and I wanted to reflect briefly on something that you may have noticed in the the page that I showed you from the Office of Engagement Initiatives, which indicated that the goal of this kind of collaboration with community is working towards social change. Of course, there's many ways to work towards social change, and not all of them are involve academic work. And they can be things as modest as voting or encouraging other people to vote, or participating in various kinds of associations, being socially responsible in your daily life. But of course, from our end, from the academic end, we look at things that in the applied sciences might be things like supporting social innovation and enterprise, or for the humanities end, raising awareness through advocacy, community organizing, and deliberative reflective dialogue. When we think about our pedagogy and the way in which we can incorporate humanities, fieldwork, and community collaboration into our courses, this is a kind of a graphic that's quite simple, but is useful to think about. And so when you think about the kind of collaborations that we call transactional, which is, I'll do this for you, here's my project. We think of things like volunteerism and service learning. And you notice that what this graphic shows is that there's a small investment on the part of both the community and the faculty in this kind of project. If you go to the gray scale, the higher one, the relational, where it's collaborative co-creating or working together with people on projects that that will help develop various kinds of capacities. These are much more intense. They're larger scale in terms of the degree of commitment. They're relational, and because they're relational, these are also the ones that would actually involve working with communities, understanding communities, co-creating with communities, and the ones in the gray scale are the ones that are much more likely to be both productive for the communities and ones where we would see the kinds of academic outputs that we think of as research. So there are topics to address that I've only begun to hint at, but I won't get to here. I just mention them briefly. And that is for anyone who's considering engaged fieldwork, one of the very important questions to think about is, how are you approaching community partnership? What is the way you want to understand your relationship with the community? Are they in agreement? What is your philosophy? What is the program model? For including engaged work in your courses, you have to rethink courses to reimagine what are your learning outcomes and instructional design. And the most important thing for these kinds of courses is to incorporate reflection on the part of the students, because that's how they learn about what they're doing, is through not just working with a community, but reflecting and doing that kind of work of critically thinking about what that engagement has meant. And then, of course, it's very important to have the community members as well as yourself engaged in assessing whether or not these were successful. So this is the end of my slides and the end of this presentation. And I'm very delighted again to have had this opportunity to spend this time with you. Amit, I don't know what your procedure is. If you have...
Debra, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I would now, with your permission, throw this session open for questions and comments from the audience. And I request Dr. Soumipendra Banerjee, my esteemed colleague, to moderate this session. So if you permit us, we will now go in for a Q&A session.
Yeah, I mean, I would request the participants to type in their questions in the chat box so that I can convey them to Professor Debra and Castillo.
Well, by the time that the questions come in, let us thank Professor Castillo for such a wonderful session. She has actually shed light on a very, very important aspect of our pedagogy today, especially for the humanities. Engaged pedagogy is something that can regain some kind of relevance for humanities. The departments underfunded and often looked down upon by others can really regain their lost prestige by engaging with the community. And thank you, Debra, for focusing our attention to this aspect.
Well, thank you, Amit. And I think for many people in the humanities, the question of engagement is part of a way of becoming a whole human being. That is, we have often separated out our academic work from our lives. And in fact, one of the things that we were looking at in that book, The Scholar as Human, is to say, no, we want to be whole human beings with whole lives where our commitments intermesh. And that's a kind of idealistic version. But also you pointed to something else, Amit, which is really important. And that is that many of us are finding our humanities departments under pressure to demonstrate their relevance for society. And so, we've been talking for many years about the crisis in the humanities. And one way of responding to the crisis is to say, no, the humanities are valuable. And one of the ways in which they're valuable is through these kinds of projects and programs where they can demonstrate to the community their relevance.
Yes, Professor Albrecht Klassen has already asked a question, and I'm reading this out. My question pertains to a fundamental issue. The social and economic issues are very obvious, but I also wonder how we can manage as literary historians, for example, to bring the beauty of the human words or poetry to the people, and how we as scholars can profit from their words and poetry today.
Thank you for the question. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about the ways in which humanities in the community are really having a strong impact. I don't know where you're located. I can see your library behind you, but one of the things that we have noticed is the falling enrollments in our humanities courses from many students. And so we also understand that we need to rethink our curricula to make it more relevant to students in this day and age. This is not sacrificing quality. It's merely saying what are some of the issues that we are not addressing, that we should be addressing, that would make things more relevant. And poetry is a perfect example, because here in the United States, at least, when students are given a choice, they have traditionally chosen to look at narrative rather than poetry. However, the relatively recent and very, very vital forms of spoken word and oral poetry have actually made poetry courses some of the most popular courses that we now offer, because students see the value of poetry for spoken word performance, and they are very, very interested in spoken word. So there's many, many ways where if we're just a little more imaginative, a little more creative in the way that we think about our projects, we can involve the community. In fact, one of our programs that we do every month, every April, because April in the United States is Poetry Month, is poetry workshops with university poets working with community members. We do readings, and they're always well attended, and people love them.
That's wonderful.
Yes, another question. A few more questions have come up. Mahinur Khatun would ask you to elaborate on rural humanities.
Okay, so thank you again. Rural Humanities is a project that was proposed to the Mellon Foundation, which is a large institution that gives funding for programs that will enhance humanities work. The Mellon Foundation supported this project, which was presented as a project to try to understand better what's happening in our rural communities that has caught us. That was, and the specific impetus was the surprise that we all felt with the way in which rural communities expressed their dissatisfaction with the current political system through voting for Donald Trump. And that surprised everyone, largely because it's much easier to do research in urban areas, and so social scientists have tended to focus on urban areas, and much more difficult to because of distances, because of a lack of confidence in academic researchers in speaking to folks that come from in rural areas. So we really don't know as much about rural communities as we should. And that was the way that this proposal was presented. It was presented also from the perspective that Cornell University is a rural university. It is not an urban university. It is located in the middle of upstate New York. Upstate New York being anything in New York outside of New York City. And it's called upstate because New York City is in the south east of the state, the southeast corner. And so this area is an area which has historically had been the source of some of the more interesting social movements in the United States. The religion of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormonism, was founded in upstate New York. The women's suffrage movement has been largely associated with places like Seneca Falls in upstate New York. The Grange movement in the 19th century, which was a farmers organization, a cultural farmers organization, was in upstate. But somehow that all fell off in the 20th century. And so we're trying to understand what is the situation of upstate New York, but we're understanding it through the humanities, through working with libraries, through working with community arts councils, through working with individuals and projects that are thinking about and addressing upstate issues, including indigenous issues, because although I did not give a land acknowledgement in the beginning, it is now becoming more common in the United States to give land acknowledgements. We are on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee peoples, and specifically in the terms of Cornell on the Cayuga Nation, and around us the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, or the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, continue to maintain very active presences. And so part of the work is also to work with them and to really see how we can collaborate with them to bring forward a greater understanding of Indigenous knowledges.
Yes, thank you, Debra, very much. Moving on to Nobida Anjum's question. Ma'am, would you please tell us something about the ethical aspects of fieldwork studies, so the ethics involved in it?
This is so important, and I thank you so much for bringing that up. This is a really, really crucial question, and I think it is something that is fundamental to any kind of work with communities. I always tell my students that we are working with, we are not going and imposing our ideas on people, and because it would be inappropriate to do so. And also, unlike some forms of work, and it's one of the reasons why I call it engaged work rather than service or volunteerism. Our position is a position of seeing the communities that collaborate with us as assets, whereas in many other kinds of projects, they're seen as someone that you go and help. And that they have liabilities that then the university can uplift. And some of the most difficult situations have arisen from people from universities going into a community and saying, I have a solution for your problems, without listening to what the people say about what they want or what they understand. And so that is one way of pre-thinking that helps us to address some of these kinds of ethical questions. But of course, the situation, it can be much more challenging, as for example, in the situation that I mentioned where we were talking with the women's organizations in central Mexico, where the tradition is that women do not speak, but nevertheless, they had significant knowledge to share. So the question there is, what is the right? What right do we have to come in and tell communities what to do? And we don't actually have that right. However, the local organizations that are run by people who are from those communities, when they reach out and say, this is a way that you can collaborate, then we feel more confident that we're not imposing upon them with our own ethical or social understandings, and are trying to meet people where they see a need.
Yeah. Another question is from Nasir Rahman. Would you like to say something about how can we shape a theoretical framework in field work in the context of the humanities?
Well, this is another, very thoughtful question, and I thank you for that question. It is, in fact, exactly that question, which is the question that exercised Shalini Puri and myself in the book that I showed you in one of my early slides, the Fieldwork in the Humanities, where we were thinking specifically about this question in the understanding that in the humanities, fieldwork has not been as common as it is in other disciplines. And so we really had to look carefully at what were some of the models in which fieldwork has been exercised, and then think how we can adapt them. So certainly one of the disciplines that's closer to us that we looked at was anthropology, and we see many examples from anthropology and the thinking in anthropology that's helpful for us in understanding both some of the methodologies as well as some of the, and I thank the previous questioner, some of the ethical issues that need to be attended to when we're thinking about fieldwork in the humanities. So the brief answer to your question is that we have our models are necessarily interdisciplinary. We are necessarily learning from other fields as we continue to develop our own way of working through the question of fieldwork in humanities-based theorizations.
Right. Thank you very much. There are no more questions as of now, but I'll just ask, there's someone, Rubel Rana, who had raised a hand. Rubel, is there any question from your side, or it was a mistake?
No, sir. No, sir.
No, sir. Thank you.
So I saw a question just pop up about psychology. Psychology is considered a social science. The humanities and arts are generally lumped together as one form of understanding knowledge. The social sciences, psychology, sociology, etc., are another form. The physical sciences like chemistry, biology, physics, another form, and of course we have the many applied areas such as studies in agriculture and life sciences of various sorts.
Right. Thank you, Debra, for patiently responding to all these queries. These were primarily methodological issues that you wonderfully addressed. Yes. So over to you, Amida, to call it a day.
Okay. Thank you. I must actually express our deep appreciation for Professor Debra and Castillo for such a wonderful presentation and such an interactive session as well. Now, a few of the things that I was really impressed with were actually her insistence about this model of equality, when she talks about in response to the ethical aspects of the field work, and Debra talked about this model of equality wherein she wanted to promote engaged pedagogy instead of, some kind of a top-down approach. So this is something that we over here may also learn from. And another thing was her insistence about the multidisciplinary aspect, the approach, wherein we can learn as academicians from the field of humanities, we can learn from other fields, we can utilize tools and insights gleaned from other fields. So with this, I must come to the end of this session. But before we call it a day, I must tell the audience that the fun doesn't stop here. On the first day of March.
Amida, just a minute. I would like to, I'm sorry for interrupting, but Professor Albrecht has another observation actually. Do we take it or?
Yes, please. No problem.
Could you also reflect on how other aspects of the humanities can appeal to the rural population if they are not coming from Spanish/Hispanic studies such as Russian, German, Italian, East Asian, etc.? And how about older aspects of humanities such as medieval literature?
This has always been a challenge, I think, for all of us in the humanities that are working in engaged projects, that so often the kinds of projects that we are doing are very presentist. That is, they're involved with things and people that are happening today, and that are related to how various kinds of literatures and cultures can interact with the kinds of expressions that are being produced today. So it has always been a challenge to include, or to think about how to include projects from earlier periods. And I'm not a medievalist, so I won't go back that far. But I will mention very briefly one project that has been a very, very successful project here, and that has been very, very wide-ranging, and that is the Fugitive Slave Project, which is a project that has a database and is also involved in collecting information from people all over, and it is related to the fact that that this area was an area through which the Underground Railroad ran during enslavement times, and in the colonial period, through the 19th century up until emancipation, one of the ways in which slave owners tried to get their enslaved people back was by advertising in the newspaper. And so one of these projects involves collecting newspaper information from all over, which is basically ads saying sometimes with graphics about this particular slave that has escaped or not escaped, and gathering all this information together in one place in a database, and then also adding on some of the other information that comes from rural communities as well on the Underground Railroad and on the passage of enslaved peoples through their areas in the early 19th to mid 19th century. So that's not as old as medieval, but it is rural in our area. As you know, United States history is shorter than in terms of these kinds of phenomena, since it only goes back a few hundred years. Before that, it's indigenous history. And but what has been very interesting for some people is that this is a very, very emotional kind of collection, in that it is the only record that we have in many cases of the existence of so many human beings is through this lens that is provided by their enemy, the person that has enslaved them. So that's just one example of something that's being done in collaboration with rural librarians in many locations.
Are there any other questions?
No, Amita, you
Okay.
can conclude.
No,
Thank you.
as I was telling you, the fun doesn't stop here, you know. On the first day of March, we have another session of Parley 2021. Professor Rosinka Chaudhary is going to talk about an entirely different topic, you know. She is going to talk about Pramotho Chaudhary, one of the very important figures in Bengali literature. And she is going to talk about Pramotho Chaudhary's concept of critique as Rashik or connoisseur. So I would like to invite all of you to join us then. The session starts at 3:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So with this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you, Debra, for being with us. It's very early in the morning over there. So I hope
special thanks to Professor.
Stay healthy.
And special thanks to Professor Albrecht Classen too for waking up at 5:30 a.m. as he just wrote.
Thank you so
Albrecht.
much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, now we request all the participants to gradually leave.
Shilpi, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, as people slowly leave the meeting area, and you can end the meeting.
Debra,
Bye,
yeah,
everyone.
bye.
Bye,
Bye. See you
Debra.
again.
Thank you.
Bye.